In the shadowed corridors of Renaissance Italy, where power shifted like sand and alliances crumbled with the dawn, Niccolo Machiavelli observed the eternal dance of human nature. His insights, born from witnessing the rise and fall of princes, the seduction of masses and the delicate art of influence, remain as relevant today as they were 5 centuries ago. But beyond the political machinations he documented lies a deeper truth. The laws that govern how we attract, influence, and ultimately transform ourselves and others. The man who sat in his study, penning observations that would echo through centuries, understood something fundamental about human psychology. He saw that beneath the veneer of civilization, beneath the courtly manners and diplomatic smiles, operated a set of immutable laws. These laws determine who commands attention, who inspires devotion, and who shapes the world around them. More importantly, he recognized that the greatest victory any individual could achieve was not the conquest of others, but the conquest of their own weaknesses. This document explores 9 fundamental laws of influence that Machiavelli identified, woven together with his most profound realization that personal transformation precedes all other forms of power. A man who destroys his weak self becomes unassailable, not because he cannot be attacked, but because he has eliminated the very vulnerabilities that make such attacks effective. Part 1. The Foundation of Influence. The first law: master the art of strategic unpredictability. In the courts of Florence, Machiavelli watched as predictable men became pawns in larger games. They followed patterns, adhered to expectations, and ultimately became tools in the hands of those who understood the power of calculated unpredictability. The first law of influence emerges from this observation. Those who control when and how they reveal themselves control the narrative of every interaction. Strategic unpredictability does not mean random behavior or chaotic decision-making. Instead, it represents the careful cultivation of mystery and the deliberate defiance of others' expectations. When Cesare Borgia would appear unexpectedly at a town's gates with overwhelming force, he wasn't merely demonstrating military might. He was wielding the psychological weapon of unpredictability. His enemies could not prepare for what they could not anticipate. In modern contexts, this translates to the individual who refuses to be categorized or contained within others' mental frameworks. They might be the executive who occasionally breaks protocol to connect directly with frontline employees, or the artist who suddenly shifts mediums after mastering one form. The power lies not in the specific action, but in the maintenance of autonomy over one's own definition. The weak self craves validation and approval, leading to predictable patterns of behavior designed to secure others' good opinions. But the transformed individual operates from internal certainty, making choices based on strategic value rather than external validation. This creates an aura of confidence and competence that others find magnetically attractive because it represents the freedom they wish they possessed. Consider the courtier who never quite reveals his full hand, who maintains cordial relationships while keeping his deepest thoughts private. He becomes valuable precisely because he cannot be fully known or controlled. People invest more energy in trying to understand him, inadvertently increasing his influence over their attention and emotional state. The second law: cultivate calculated distance. Machiavelli observed that familiarity, while comfortable, diminishes power. The prince who became too close to his subjects lost the mystique necessary for command. The advisor who revealed all his thoughts became common rather than valuable. This insight forms the second law. Influence grows in proportion to the strategic management of availability and intimacy. Calculated distance doesn't mean coldness or cruelty. Rather, it represents the sophisticated understanding that scarcity creates value, that mystery generates interest, and that respect often requires a certain space between individuals. The master of this law knows when to engage deeply and when to withdraw, when to reveal vulnerability and when to maintain strength. The weak self seeks constant connection and validation, often overwhelming others with its needs for attention and reassurance. It shares too much, too quickly, dissolving the natural tension that creates attraction. But the individual who has conquered this weakness understands that relationships, like stories, require pacing and development. In the Renaissance courts, the most influential figures were often those who granted audiences sparingly, who made their presence feel like a gift rather than an obligation. Their words carried weight because they were not cheapened by overuse. Their attention felt valuable because it was not freely given to everyone. This principle operates across all forms of human interaction. The friend who is always available becomes taken for granted, while the one who maintains some mystery and independence remains intriguing. The professional who is constantly visible may be seen as dedicated, but the one who appears at crucial moments with solutions is seen as essential. The transformed individual practices this law not from manipulation, but from genuine self-respect and understanding of human psychology. They have interests, projects, and inner lives that don't revolve around any single relationship or external validation. This natural independence creates the space that allows attraction and influence to flourish. The third law, project competent authority. In every court Machiavelli studied, he noticed that true influence belonged not necessarily to those with the highest titles, but to those who projected unshakable competence in their domain. The third law recognizes that authority isn't granted by external validation alone. It must be embodied and demonstrated through consistent excellence and quiet confidence. Competent authority differs from loud dominance or aggressive assertion. It's the calm certainty of someone who knows their capabilities and doesn't need to prove them through theatrics. Machiavelli saw this in effective generals who never raised their voices because their track record spoke loudly enough. He observed it in advisors whose counsel was sought not because they demanded attention, but because their insights consistently proved valuable. The weak self often confuses authority with aggression or competence with boasting. It tries to claim respect through loud declarations or by diminishing others. But true authority emerges from genuine capability combined with a self-assurance that doesn't need constant external confirmation. This law manifests in the professional who solves problems quietly while others debate, in the friend who offers wise counsel without being asked, in the leader who makes difficult decisions with apparent ease. Their influence grows because others naturally turn to competence when challenges arise. The individual who has conquered their weak self no longer needs to perform authority, they simply inhabit it. They've developed real skills, real knowledge, and real wisdom through dedicated effort rather than seeking shortcuts to respect. This authentic foundation makes their authority both undeniable and attractive to others who recognize genuine capability. Moreover, competent authority includes knowing the limits of one's expertise and being comfortable with that knowledge. The transformed individual doesn't pretend to know everything, but demonstrates mastery in their chosen domains while remaining humble about areas outside their competence. This honesty actually enhances rather than diminishes their authority because it proves their judgment can be trusted. Part 2. The Psychology of Attraction, the fourth law. Understand and leverage emotional timing. Machiavelli's keenest insight may have been his recognition that human beings are fundamentally emotional creatures who happen to think, rather than thinking creatures who happen to feel. The fourth law acknowledges that influence depends heavily on understanding and working with emotional rhythms rather than against them. In the political arena, Machiavelli observed that successful leaders didn't just present logical arguments. They presented the right arguments at the right emotional moments. They understood when people were ready to hear difficult truths, when they needed encouragement, and when they required firm direction. The timing of emotional impact often mattered more than the content of the message. This law requires deep observation and empathy. The transformed individual learns to read the emotional states of others not to manipulate them, but to communicate more effectively. They recognize when someone is in a state of openness versus defensiveness, when they're seeking validation versus challenge, when they need space versus support. The weak self often ignores emotional context, blundering ahead with its own agenda regardless of others' receptivity. It might choose the worst possible moment to offer criticism or advice, then wonder why its well-intentioned words were rejected. But the individual who has mastered this law pays attention to emotional seasons and adjusts their approach accordingly. Consider the manager who waits until after a successful project completion to discuss areas for improvement, or the friend who senses when someone needs to vent before being offered solutions. Their influence grows because their words land in fertile emotional ground rather than falling on deaf ears. This law also applies to self-influence. The transformed individual learns to recognize their own emotional rhythms and work with them rather than against them. They might tackle difficult tasks when their energy is naturally high, or schedule important conversations when they're in a calm, centered state. This emotional intelligence becomes a source of consistent effectiveness that others find attractive and trustworthy. The fifth law, create value through selective association. Machiavelli understood that reputation was often more important than reality, and that reputation was largely determined by association. The fifth law recognizes that influence grows through careful curation of connections and strategic alignment with respected individuals and worthy causes. This doesn't mean climbing social ladders or abandoning genuine relationships for strategic ones. Rather, it means being thoughtful about how one's associations reflect and shape their identity. The transformed individual chooses connections based on mutual value creation rather than neediness or opportunism. In Renaissance courts, ambitious individuals aligned themselves with rising stars and worthy causes. They became known not just for their individual qualities, but for their judgment in choosing associations. This pattern created upward spirals, where good associations led to better opportunities, which led to even more valuable connections. The weak self often associates with whoever provides immediate validation or comfort, regardless of the long-term impact on reputation or personal growth. It might maintain relationships that drain energy or align with causes that reflect poorly on their character. But the transformed individual evaluates associations based on shared values and mutual elevation. This law extends beyond personal relationships to include professional associations, causes supported, and even entertainment consumed. The individual who consistently associates with excellence, integrity, and growth becomes known for these qualities themselves. Their influence grows because others begin to see them as a gateway to valuable connections and elevated experiences. The key insight is that people naturally categorize others based on their associations. By deliberately surrounding themselves with impressive, ethical, and ambitious individuals, the transformed person elevates their own standing in others' minds. This isn't about using people, but about creating mutually beneficial relationships that enhance everyone involved. The sixth law: master the balance of vulnerability and strength. Perhaps no aspect of human attraction is more complex than the balance between vulnerability and strength. Machiavelli observed that leaders who showed no weakness seemed inhuman and distant, while those who revealed too much weakness lost respect and authority. The sixth law addresses this delicate balance that creates both trust and admiration. True influence requires moments of strategic vulnerability that humanize the individual while demonstrating their underlying strength. This might mean sharing past struggles that were overcome, admitting mistakes while showing lessons learned, or revealing fears in contexts where courage is also displayed. The weak self typically errs on one extreme or the other. It either maintains rigid facades that prevent genuine connection, or overshares in ways that burden others and diminish respect. The transformed individual learns to calibrate vulnerability appropriately for each relationship and context. Machiavelli saw this balance in effective rulers who could admit uncertainty about specific decisions while maintaining confidence in their overall judgment. They showed enough humanity to earn affection while demonstrating enough competence to command respect. This combination created deep loyalty that pure strength or pure vulnerability could never achieve alone. In modern contexts, this law applies to the leader who shares the struggles behind their success, making their achievements feel more inspiring than intimidating. It's the friend who admits their fears while also demonstrating resilience. It's the professional who acknowledges challenges while maintaining confidence in their ability to address them. The key is that vulnerability must be authentic and purposeful, rather than manipulative or excessive. The transformed individual shares struggles that others can relate to and learn from, creating connection without creating burden. They reveal enough humanity to be loved while maintaining enough strength to be respected. This balance also requires understanding the difference between vulnerability and weakness. Vulnerability involves the courage to be authentic about struggles and imperfections. Weakness involves being dominated by those struggles rather than learning from them. The person who has conquered their weak self can be vulnerable about past weaknesses without being current victims of them. Part 3. The ultimate transformation. The seventh law: develop unshakable internal reference points. Machiavelli recognized that the most powerful individuals were those whose sense of identity and worth came from internal rather than external sources. The seventh law addresses the development of unshakable internal reference points that make an individual truly independent and therefore genuinely attractive to others. External reference points create vulnerability because they can be manipulated or withdrawn by others. The person who depends on others' approval for their sense of worth becomes a puppet whose strings can be pulled by anyone willing to withhold validation. But the individual with strong internal reference points maintains stability regardless of external circumstances. This doesn't mean ignoring feedback or becoming arrogant. Rather, it means developing such a clear sense of personal values, goals, and identity that external opinions inform but don't control decision-making. The transformed individual considers others' perspectives while maintaining the final authority over their own choices. Machiavelli observed this quality in leaders who could make unpopular decisions when they believed those decisions were correct. They valued others' good opinion but didn't require it for psychological stability. This independence made them more trustworthy because others knew their actions were based on principle rather than expediency. The weak self constantly seeks external validation and adjusts behavior based on others' reactions. It might change political opinions based on social pressure, alter personal style to fit in with different groups, or abandon goals when others express doubt. But the transformed individual maintains consistency across contexts because their behavior flows from internal certainty rather than external pressure. This law also involves developing the ability to self-validate accomplishments and progress. Instead of constantly seeking others' recognition, the individual with strong internal reference points can acknowledge their own growth and celebrate their own victories. This self-sufficiency becomes attractive because it represents the freedom others wish they possessed. The practical development of internal reference points involves regular self-reflection, clarification of personal values, and the cultivation of interests and goals that don't depend on others' participation or approval. It means building a rich inner life that provides satisfaction regardless of external circumstances. The eighth law: embody authentic confidence through competence. The distinction between authentic confidence and performed confidence became clear to Machiavelli as he observed both successful and failed leaders. The eighth law recognizes that true confidence must be built on a foundation of actual competence and genuine self-knowledge, creating an unshakable presence that others find both attractive and trustworthy. Authentic confidence differs fundamentally from bravado or arrogance. It emerges from honest assessment of one's abilities combined with acceptance of limitations. The truly confident individual knows what they can do well and what they still need to learn. This honest self-awareness creates a calm certainty that others find deeply appealing. Machiavelli noticed that performed confidence often cracked under pressure, revealing the insecurity beneath. But authentic confidence remained stable because it was based on reality rather than illusion. The leader who had genuinely developed their capabilities could remain calm in crisis because they trusted their ability to handle whatever arose. The weak self often tries to fake confidence through aggressive behavior, loud declarations, or dismissive attitudes toward others. But these performances require constant energy and eventually reveal themselves as hollow. The transformed individual builds confidence through the slow accumulation of competence and the gradual expansion of their capabilities. This law requires patient investment in actual skill development rather than shortcuts to appearing confident. It means practicing until abilities become reliable, studying until knowledge becomes deep, and reflecting until self-awareness becomes accurate. The confidence that emerges from this foundation cannot be easily shaken because it rests on substantial ground. Authentic confidence also includes the ability to say, "I don't know," when appropriate, to ask for help when needed, and to continue learning throughout life. These behaviors paradoxically increase rather than decrease others' respect because they demonstrate secure self-awareness rather than fragile ego protection. The individual who embodies this law becomes a source of stability for others. In uncertain situations, people naturally look to those who seem genuinely confident rather than those who are merely performing confidence. This gravitational effect creates opportunities for leadership and influence that emerge naturally from demonstrated competence. The ninth law: transcend need through abundance mindset. The final and perhaps most profound law that Machiavelli implied through his observations concerns the transcendence of neediness through the cultivation of an abundance mindset. The ninth law recognizes that true influence comes from operating from a place of fullness rather than emptiness, giving rather than taking, and abundance rather than scarcity. Neediness repels because it creates burden and pressure in relationships. The needy individual unconsciously communicates that others are responsible for their emotional well-being, creating an exhausting dynamic that most people instinctively avoid. But the person who operates from abundance becomes attractive because they enhance others' lives rather than draining them. Machiavelli observed that the most influential courtiers were often those who seemed to need nothing from the prince, making their loyalty feel like a gift rather than a transaction. Their advice carried weight because it wasn't motivated by personal desperation. Their presence was welcomed because it added value rather than creating obligation. The abundance mindset isn't about material wealth, though it can include financial security. More importantly, It's about emotional and psychological abundance, having enough internal resources that one can focus on contributing to others rather than constantly seeking from them. This shift in focus creates a fundamentally different energy that others find magnetic. The weak self operates from scarcity, constantly worried about not having enough attention, love, respect, or resources. It approaches relationships and opportunities from a place of taking rather than giving. But the transformed individual has developed sufficient internal resources that they can afford to be generous with others. This law manifests in the professional who helps colleagues succeed without worrying about competition, the friend who listens more than they speak, the leader who develops others rather than hoarding opportunities. Their influence grows because people are naturally drawn to those who make them feel better about themselves. The cultivation of abundance mindset requires addressing the internal wounds and fears that create neediness. It involves building genuine self-worth, developing multiple sources of satisfaction and meaning, and creating systems that provide security without depending on any single external source. When an individual truly embodies this law, they become a source of abundance for others. People seek their company because interactions leave them feeling energized rather than drained. This gravitational effect creates natural influence that doesn't require manipulation or coercion. The ultimate realization, destroying the weak self throughout his observations of human nature. Machiavelli arrived at a profound understanding that transcended political strategy. The individual who could overcome their own internal weaknesses became essentially invulnerable to external attack, not because they couldn't be harmed, but because they had eliminated the psychological vulnerabilities that made such harm devastating. The weak self is characterized by dependence on external validation, fear of rejection, need for constant approval, inability to tolerate uncertainty, and reactive behavior based on emotional triggers. These weaknesses create predictable patterns that others can exploit, whether consciously or unconsciously. The individual dominated by these patterns becomes a victim of circumstances rather than a creator of outcomes. But the person who systematically addresses these internal vulnerabilities transforms into something qualitatively different. They develop the ability to maintain stability regardless of external chaos, to pursue goals despite others' disapproval, to remain calm in the face of criticism, and to make decisions based on principle rather than pressure. This transformation isn't about becoming hard or unfeeling. Rather, it's about developing such internal security that external storms don't disturb inner peace. The transformed individual can remain open, loving, and generous because they're no longer operating from a place of desperate need. The process of destroying the weak self requires honest self-assessment, consistent effort to develop competence and character, regular practice of uncomfortable but growth-promoting activities, and gradual expansion of comfort zones. It means facing fears rather than avoiding them, accepting responsibility rather than blaming circumstances, and choosing growth over comfort. Most importantly, it requires understanding that this transformation is never complete. The weak self doesn't disappear permanently but must be continually overcome through daily choices and consistent practice. The individual who achieves mastery is the one who accepts this ongoing responsibility rather than seeking a final state of perfection. When someone has genuinely made progress in this transformation, it shows in countless subtle ways. They move through the world with a different energy, calm rather than anxious, generous rather than grasping, curious rather than defensive. This transformed presence becomes naturally attractive to others who recognize the rare quality of genuine inner strength. The 9 laws of influence work synergistically with this fundamental transformation. Strategic unpredictability becomes possible when one is no longer enslaved by the need for approval. Calculated distance becomes natural when one has rich internal resources. Competent authority emerges from genuine development rather than insecure posturing. Emotional timing becomes easier to read when one's own emotions are stable. Selective association becomes natural when one operates from abundance rather than desperation. The balance of vulnerability and strength becomes achievable when strength is real rather than performed. Internal reference points develop naturally when external validation is no longer desperately needed. Authentic confidence emerges from actual competence rather than wishful thinking. And abundance mindset becomes possible when scarcity thinking has been systematically addressed. The ultimate irony that Machiavelli understood is that the person who becomes truly independent of others' opinions becomes most attractive to others. The individual who needs nothing from others becomes someone others want to be around. The person who cannot be easily influenced becomes naturally influential. This transformation represents the deepest form of power available to any individual: power over oneself. External circumstances may still create challenges, others may still behave unpredictably, and life may still present difficulties. But the person who has conquered their weak self maintains the ability to choose their response to any situation. In the end, Machiavelli's greatest insight wasn't about politics or strategy, but about human potential. He recognized that every individual has the capacity to transcend their limitations, to overcome their conditioning, and to become the author of their own story rather than a victim of circumstances. The man who destroys his weak self can never be truly destroyed by others because he has eliminated the internal mechanisms through which external destruction operates. He may face setbacks, losses, and challenges, but he maintains the internal resources to rebuild, adapt, and continue growing regardless of what others do or don't do. This is the ultimate freedom that Machiavelli glimpsed in his studies of human nature, the freedom that comes from self-mastery, the influence that emerges from inner strength, and the attraction that radiates from authentic abundance. It represents the highest achievement available to any individual, the transformation from weak victim to powerful creator of one's own destiny. The path is available to anyone willing to undertake the patient work of self-development, honest self-assessment, and consistent growth-oriented action. The 9 laws provide a framework, but the ultimate journey remains deeply personal and uniquely individual. Yet for those who commit to this transformation, the rewards extend far beyond mere influence or attraction. They include the profound satisfaction of becoming who they were truly meant to be.